Well, tonight we're going to start with King Ahaziah of Judah. And those of you who were here last Wednesday night, you may remember that we noted that things have really gone from bad to worse in Judah. Although they had a couple of good kings in a row, they had Asa and Jehoshaphat. And while those men were generally faithful to the Lord, you remember we discussed that they had entered into some alliances with Israel that they were not permitted to enter into. And as a result of that alliance, that was going to come to have a direct influence upon the kings of Judah. And the reason for that is because a part of the alliance that was entered into was that the daughter of Israel's king Ahab was to marry Jehoram, who was to become the king of Judah. And so, as we talked last week, talking about King Jehoram, where we left off, Jehoram has been put to death by Jehu. Jehu was charged by God to go in and to essentially wipe out the family of Ahab. That whole family was to be put to death. Jehoram has now died. Well, Jehoram, at the time of his death, he only had one son who was still living. And the reason for this, you may remember that during the reign of Jehoram, one of those neighboring nations came in and killed all of the other sons of Jehoram. And so there was only one left, the youngest son, a man by the name of Ahaziah. Well, Ahaziah, it's interesting. You know, last week we talked about that you've had two kings by the name of Jehoram, one over Judah, one over Israel. Well, now we're going to see a second King Ahaziah. There's already been a King Ahaziah over Israel. Now there is going to be a King Ahaziah over Judah. King Ahaziah over Judah is the nephew of King Ahaziah over Israel. And so more than likely, and most commentators believe that he was named after his uncle. And certainly during that day and time, that would have been a common thing that would have been done. But whenever he comes to power, when Ahaziah comes to power, his uncle, who has the same name as his father, his uncle Jehoram, is still reigning over Israel. Jehoram is in his 12th year of reigning over Israel at this time. And Ahaziah, he's a very young man. He's only 22 years old when he becomes the king of Judah. But we find that he's only going to reign over that kingdom for 1 year. 1 year. 2 Kings 8:26 tells us this. But something that I found very interesting as I've gone through and I've studied the parallels between the Kings and the Chronicle accounts of these kings. Whenever you look at 2 Chronicles 22 and verse 2, notice it tells us that Ahaziah was 42 years old when he became king. But whenever we look at 2 Kings 8:26, it tells us that he was 22 years old when he became king. Now, most people believe that what took place was when the scribes were initially transcribing the books of the Chronicles, that they made a mistake. Because if Ahaziah was 42 years old at the time that he became king, he would have been 2 years older than his father, because his father was only 40 years old when he died. And so 22 is going to be the accurate number. He was 22 years old whenever he became king. But since Ahaziah was still a very young man, and since he had a very dominant figure in his life for a mother, we find that his mother, a woman by the name of Athaliah, who was the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel, she would come to have a strong influence upon his life. In fact, 2 Chronicles 22 in verse 3 says that Ahaziah walked in the ways of the house of Ahab, for his mother advised him to do wickedly. His mother was leading him down the very same path that she had led her husband, and she was leading both of them down the path that she had been led down by her wicked parents. But we find that the wicked ways of Ahaziah is ultimately what's going to bring about his downfall after reigning for only 1 year. Because following the advice of these ungodly advisors, Ahaziah decides that he is going to enter into another alliance. And he's going to go into war with his uncle, King Jehoram of Israel. Well, they go into battle against Hazael, the king of the Syrians, and Jehoram suffers a very serious injury. Well, after he is injured, he goes back to his palace at Jezreel. There he is recuperating. And 2 Chronicles 22 and verse 6, and also 2 Kings 8, 28 and 29, tell us that Ahaziah decides that he's going to go and pay his uncle a visit. Don't know exactly the purpose of the visit. Don't know if it was just to check on him. Don't know if it was something to do with the war. But he's going to go and he's going to be in the company of his uncle Jehoram. Well, this visit is what's going to initiate the events that ultimately bring his downfall. Because you may remember from our study last week that Jehu, who was a commander in the Israelite army, he had been charged by God to do away with, to wipe out all of the family of Ahab. And so Jehu goes to Jezreel with the purpose in mind of killing Jehoram, the son of Ahab. And from our study last week, you remember that Jehoram, he rides out in a chariot to meet Jehu, expecting some type of good report on battle. Jehu lets him know what his intentions are, and while Jehoram is trying to flee back into the city, he is shot with an arrow, and he is killed. But 2 Chronicles 22 and verse 8 tells us that after the death of Jehoram, that Jehu doesn't stop there. It tells us that he then goes and he kills all the princes of Judah and the sons of Ahaziah's brothers who served Ahaziah. So notice what he's trying to do. He's going in, he's trying to wipe them all out. He's trying to wipe out that entire family. But therein lies a problem, folks. Because do you remember a promise that God had made to Solomon shortly before Solomon's death? A promise that an heir of David would always be seated upon the throne of that kingdom? Well, now, because of the intermarriage with the family of Ahab, and this charge to Jehu that he is to go in and kill all of the family of Ahab, it kind of has Judah in a predicament. And it's interesting how this all works out. And we'll see this when we get into the next ruler here. But we find that when Ahaziah, he's there, he sees Jehoram put to death, basically. And he flees. He goes, he's trying his best to get away, to save his life. He goes and he hides in Samaria. But eventually Jehu tracks him down and he too is put to death. But we find that Jehu did something very interesting with Ahaziah's body. He was willing to carry it back to Jerusalem so that he could be buried along with his relatives, along with his fathers. Because as 2 Chronicles 22 and verse 9 tells us, he is the son of, or in this case it's meaning a descendant of, Jehoshaphat, who sought the Lord with all of his heart. So even though this was a wicked king, because of his association with this godly family, we find that this act of kindness was shown. He was the king, and he was allowed to be brought back and be buried along with his relatives. But now, Judah is in an even worse situation than it was before. Because now, the Bible tells us the house of Ahaziah had no one to assume power over the kingdom. Now you stop and you wonder. For 2 generations now, they've been trying to wipe out the entire royal family. You remember Jehoram came in, had all of his brothers killed. And then now you have Jehu coming in trying to kill all of the descendants that have any connection to Ahab whatsoever. So that's going to be anyone that has any connection with Jehoram and Ahaziah. So now, what are they going to do? You may remember I mentioned how many sons did Jehoram have left when he died? Just one, Ahaziah. And now Ahaziah is dead. Well, folks, history has often proven time and again that during evil times, evil people are going to seize power. That's what's going to happen now with Judah. But as we do with each one of these kings, let me give you just a brief application that we can make from the life of Ahaziah. And that application is this, folks: faithful people can still make mistakes. And faithful people can make mistakes that have effects that are long-lasting. Jehoshaphat and Asa are both remembered as faithful kings. They are described as faithful to God. But because of that lapse of judgment that they made in allying themselves with King Ahab, we find now that 3 generations have been affected by that bad decision. And it's not over yet. 3 generations. For we find that Ahab's daughter, Athaliah, she's going to be a thorn in the side of Judah for a long time. For a long time. She influenced her husband. She influenced her son. And she influenced that nation to follow in the ways of her parents, Ahab and Jezebel. So yes, it is possible for faithful people to make mistakes. Now, we as Christians, we understand that if we make a mistake and we repent, God will forgive us. But that doesn't mean that there are not still going to be consequences that we have to face. That doesn't mean that we may not still have to rebuild our reputation. That does not mean that it has not impacted our loved ones or our church family. There are still things that are there. There are still consequences. And that's what we see coming from these sinful alliances.